Hello and welcome to the Child Psych podcast. I'm Tanya Johnson, registered psychologist, registered play therapist, co-founder of the Institute of Child Psychology. Today we are thrilled to have Dr. Nicholas Cordaris with us. Dr. Nicholas Cordaris is an Ivy League educated psychologist, an internationally acclaimed speaker, and one of the world's top addiction experts. He is the CEO of Omega Recovery in Texas, the creator of CHAP, which is a really cool program. It's an intensive experiential form of nature immersion therapy. He is also a clinical professor at Stony Brook Medicine. Dr. Cordaris, you may be aware of his book that came out, what is it now, a decade ago?
2016, just about a decade,
yes.
9 years.
Glow Kids, one of the books that absolutely changed how we work at the Institute of Child Psychology. He also has another two books, so Plato and How Plato and Pythagoras Can Save Your Life, amazing, and his newest book, Digital Madness. For everybody listening in, please remember to leave a review or rating on your favorite podcast channel. Okay, so Glow Kids published in 2016 and then Digital Madness in 2022. Nicholas, I have so many questions about this. Your experience in writing those two books. What was it like? Because things have changed and really not changed at the same time.
Right. I think when I wrote Glow Kids in 2016, it was I was shocked. I was doing a lot of clinical work with adolescents and young adults, and in 2016, it doesn't feel like that long ago, but people were extremely underaware of the problem. I looked around the landscape. I was looking around mental health, and I was looking around in educational systems, and people weren't really talking about tech addiction or screen time issues. People were beginning to say there's an adolescent mental health crisis, but they weren't connecting the dots. And being an addiction expert, I looked around and I just said, clearly there's something happening here. And that's when I really began to start digging into the research and looking at it. There was a lot of research out there that was connecting screen time with depression, anxiety, ADHD, attentional issues, the loneliness epidemic that we're talking about. Screen time was significantly changing our society, but yet it seemed like most of the adults were too busy playing Candy Crush to notice. And so that was I wanted to put a book out there that sort of raised the red flag, like, Houston, we have a problem.
Honestly, Nicholas, I don't think it was until your book, and I read it right when it came out, I don't think that I'd even really realized that there was anything big. I knew some kids were struggling, but as I read your book, I was like, oh, this is way bigger than what we realized.
Well, and I think now the question has been asked and answered: is there such a thing as screen addiction? Because at that time it was highly controversial. I wrote an article called "Digital Heroin" that became very controversial too. But now, at least gaming addiction is an official ICD-11 diagnosis. It's become more legitimized. But you can't be living in 21st century society and not look around and see that everyone is impacted. We're impacted. You're impacted. I'm impacted by our new digitally immersed world. Some are more impacted than others based on their age, based on some other comorbidities or vulnerabilities. But this idea that somehow we weren't being changed because of this new immersive way, which it feels like we've always been in this digital world, and yet from a chronological or evolutionary standpoint, it's been the blink of an eye. It's really been the last 10 to 15 years that our whole society has had a seismic shift in how we do the human thing.
It's crazy. Did you find in writing Digital Madness, because there is now so much more awareness and information, that the journey in writing that book felt very different?
Yeah, I think the mission for the first book was to raise awareness that devices can be habituating, that there can be such a thing called tech addiction or screen addiction or by any other name. The mission for the second book was to say, now that we are aware that we can become as we become mad for our devices are increasingly driving us mad, and that there was a correlation and a causal link to the mental health crisis that everyone was in a panic about and screen time. There was a reason why younger people disproportionately were struggling with psychiatric issues than older people. And when I started looking at the generational cohorts, and you started looking at starting at baby boomers and going down to Gen X and millennials and Gen Z and Gen Alpha, the younger the generational cohort, the more in psychiatric distress they were, the higher rates of anxiety, depression, suicide, self-harm, overdose. And so there was something there. And my hypothesis had been the more screen immersed the generation was, the more unwell they were. And that seems to have been borne out. And that was the goal of the second book, to say, yes, tech addiction is a thing, but what is what's the byproduct now of our tech immersed lives? What's the mental health crisis that we're all talking about, and how can we begin to address that?
It's funny, I feel like you, in many ways, I know many people are very familiar with Jonathan Haidt's work now, but I feel like in many ways, you were a forerunner to everything that's happening now. You saw it years and years and years ago.
Yeah, was I Nostradamus? And so, yeah, I like to think I was. I did in the second book called said that I felt like a Paul Revere. I did feel a little bit like I was sort of riding on horseback, trying to sprint into the night, saying, "There's an issue here. People wake up," because again, 10 years ago, I think we were all so seduced and awestruck by our device. Because let's face it, our devices are pretty cool, right? Our smartphones are pretty amazing. And I think the adults, we were so amazed at these shiny new handheld marvels of the modern age that we just weren't looking down at the kids and seeing how these were disproportionately affecting them. So I analogize it like we love, you could buy a brand new beautiful car and you could be driving it around and saying, look how cool my car is. But we don't give the car keys to our 7-year-olds. And we don't, because it's not age appropriate technology. And if we do give such powerful technology to children, it's going to have a more significant impact than it has on the adults who are hopefully fully developed brains, depending on what age we're at.
Absolutely, absolutely. In the preface of Glow Kids, you've got an updated preface in there. You talk about this email that you received from the US Air Force. Can you share a little bit about that request and sort of the alarm bells that it set off for you?
Yeah, it was right before COVID. I want to say it was about 2018. And I received an email from the person who was the head of the mental health support services for the Air Force. And there's an acronym, and I can't think of the acronym right now, but these are all the folks that treat the PTSD and all the mental health issues, either psychologists, social workers, psychiatric nurse practitioners. And they sent me an email saying, we'd like you to do a training for the Air Force, all the Air Force mental health staff. And it was going to be in Florida that year. There was going to be about 300 clinicians there. And can I do a tech addiction sensitization, a training, a treatment, a training? And I said, oh, okay, what seems to be happening in the Air Force that you're asking me to do a training? And this was the part that really left me, had my jaw drop, quite honestly. I don't shock easily, but I was shocked when she responded. She said, well, we're having an epidemic of video game addiction, screen overuse, whatever you want to call it, in the Air Force specifically. And, these are young men. These airmen are essentially teenagers, 18, 19-year-olds who are coming out of video game culture. And if they don't drink or drug, because we drug test on the bases, but if you go to any military base in the country now, you're going to see gaming addicted young men who just can't stop video gaming. And the kicker was, in the last year, we had 5 Air Force babies died in their crib due to parental neglect because their airman fathers had been on multiple day jags of gaming and they neglected the baby in the crib, to the point that the Department of Defense had to come up with a new designation for the death certificate called death by electronic distraction. So that knocked my socks off, because at that point in 2018, I was still on television debating people whether tech addiction is a real thing. And now I had this, very impressive military mental health clinician saying, we've had 5 babies die as a result of their father's gaming addiction. And to the point where they, in all 5 cases, it was World of Warcraft. And in all 5 cases, the male airmen had their wives were gone for the weekend, or they'd left the husband alone with the baby. And so that to me was, here I am trying to debate people whether this is even an addiction, and we have babies dying in the crib with airmen. And she made it a point to say, these aren't just pimply faced 14-year-olds. These are trained military personnel. We have very low rates of child maltreatment in the armed forces. So this is an anomaly, but this is very specific to this gaming issue. So that was an eye-opener, to say the least, for me.
Yeah, heartbreaking, absolutely heartbreaking. And you touched earlier a little bit on that digital heroin, and this is what's playing in here. Can you explain to our listeners what you mean by digital heroin and how that addictive process actually works?
Yeah, and I know that we're currently going through a fentanyl scourge, over 110,000 overdoses and 70, 80 some odd thousand of them are fentanyl or opioid based. So this is not trying to trivialize opioid addiction. This is trying to really highlight how compulsive it is from a neurological standpoint, because what changed over the last few years was we started getting brain imaging research that started really showing, if you look at it, the evidence is clear on this. If you look at the fMRI scans of an opioid addict and you look at the fMRI scans of a gaming addict, they look exactly the same in terms of the effect on the prefrontal cortex. So literally what happens in the brain is the So the DGM, the dense gray matter of the prefrontal cortex in the opiate addict and in the gaming addict begins to actually literally shrink and atrophy over time. So as most of your audience knows, the prefrontal cortex is our executive functioning. That's our decision making. That's our consequential thinking. That's the part that mediates our impulsivity. And so if nothing else, what we're doing is we're hardwiring children, adolescents, young adults to be highly impulsive because we're compromising that part of their brain that allows them to not be impulsive. In the same way that the drug addict, the more that an addict engages in their drug of choice, the more that they essentially break that part of their brain that allows them to not be impulsive towards their addiction. So it's a double whammy. And so that brain imaging research, I think, was an eye opener for a lot of clinicians who realized this isn't just, because I think most lay people were able to understand if I ingest a substance, it can change my brain neurophysiologically. But they were less aware that if I engage in a visual experience, it could change my brain. But certainly we know that experiences like trauma can change the brain. So it's not really that shocking to understand that visual experiences can also shape and change the neurophysiology of the brain.
And the dopamine impact, what's happening there? Whether it's a game or whether it's social media, what is actually happening with the dopamine there?
Right. So most addiction, the main neurotransmitter, as you know, is dopamine. Dopamine is the one, and so there's a part of the brain called the mesolimbic dopamine reward loop. And when we engage in pleasurable dopamine activating or dopaminergic experiences, we tend to raise dopamine levels. And so if you hit a free throw in basketball, if you eat a piece of chocolate, if you have sex, dopamine gets released. And depending on, there's about a dozen etiological theories about addiction, but for a variety of reasons, there are some people that are more vulnerable to chasing those feel-good experiences. And so dopamine is the key neurotransmitter in addiction. And so what we find with things like screen experiences, and not all screen experiences are created equal, so it's like first-person shooter games and some other platforms really raise our dopamine levels significantly. And in one study that was printed in Nature magazine done by Dr. Cope, he showed that video games raise dopamine to the same extent as a sexual experience does. Wow. With the difference being, and when I give talks about this, sometimes I will say, not to be crude, but sexual experiences tend to be more time limited, more finite, unless you're Sting or some other practitioner. But I've had gamers who have gamed for 12 hours, 18 hours, 24 hours straight. So you're spiking dopamine and you're creating this dopamine overload, this dopamine desensitization. And so essentially you're feeding into this addictive pattern where you now need this dopamine spike to feel normal, but you're also burning out, you're desensitizing your dopamine receptors. And what that looks like in the real world for an adolescent or a young adult, if you've been so overstimulated by these hyper-immersive, arousing, visual, sometimes virtual experiences, it makes everything else seem flat by comparison. The world becomes gray when you're not in those hyper-immersive experiences. And so that's a significant problem.
And for the Air Force, as we were just talking, for those men who were struggling, what I'm hearing is that they were experiencing dopamine, their ability to kind of use that prefrontal cortex was compromised, and then we were seeing hours and hours of playing to the extent where children were dying.
Yeah, and with any addiction, what it does, Dr. Heyman had written for the NIH, he'd written an article that talked about addiction as a disease of now. Addiction tends to really collapse your consequential thinking, and so if you're that young father who's got the baby in the crib and you are in your addictive experience, whether you're smoking crack or playing a video game, playing in an addictive way, you are in this, I don't want to call it a Buddhist, because the Buddhists talk about being in the now, but they're now in a way that's negative. There are such blinders on that they have forgotten, or they're less aware that their baby is in the crib and it needs food or to be changed. All they care about is staying in that moment. And that's addiction.
You mentioned earlier that some people are just more vulnerable to addiction. We have some kids that can play games and turn it off, and then other kids that really, really struggle. What makes a child or teen more vulnerable to that addiction process?
Yeah, sometimes it can be a bit of Russian roulette, because I've seen some young kids or adolescents who seem like they had all the protective factors, and yet they still fell prey to gaming when they went down that rabbit hole. But we did talk, in our profession, we talk about risk and protective factors, right? Protective factors tend to be healthy supports at home and education level and intellectual capacity and resilience and some of those other things that we talk about having, I use the phrase having a healthy psychological immune system. So the healthier your psychological immune system, the more resistant you would be to, let's call them virtual toxic viruses, whether it's social media or gaming. The more vulnerable, definitely we see young people on the spectrum. Spectrum children tend to be much more vulnerable to losing themselves in deep rabbit holes because of the interpersonal social skills make them more prone towards screen experiences, and also their perseveration and hyper-focus on one particular thing can make them be more vulnerable to really losing themselves in screen experiences. If someone has underlying mood disorders, if you're underlying depression or anxiety, you can definitely self-medicate with screen experiences. So those folks will be more vulnerable, but it's a bit of the chicken or the egg, or it's a bit of that vicious cycle. I analogize it to somebody who has depression, an adult who has depression because they've lost their spouse and they're going through bereavement issues, and now they start drinking. And so now you had depression to begin with, but now you're drinking. The drinking is also depressant. The more I drink, the more depressed I get. The more depressed I get, the more I drink. That's that vicious cycle that we see a lot of time with a lot of our young people in screen time. There may be an underlying vulnerability there. They self-medicate it with the screen time, and the screen time exacerbates it, makes it worse.
It makes so much sense. One of the arguments, and I know you've probably heard this 100 times, is that when we talk about kind of all the things we need to be super cautious about with screens, is that very often people start to list the benefits of either gaming or being connected via social media platforms. What are your thoughts when we create this balance of the pros and cons when it comes to screens?
And that's a great question, right? And the only research that I've seen, like for example, with gaming and let's call it neurophysiological benefits, there's a part of the brain called the salience network, which has to do with hand-eye coordination, that does seem to improve with gamers. Gamers get better hand-eye coordination. Okay, perhaps, I will cede that point that perhaps gamers can get better hand-eye coordination. So, and in the one article that I read that said that could potentially make them better drone pilots. Okay, but does that outweigh the detriments, the mental health impacts? Because we know that increased screen time correlates with increased depression, anxiety, and all these other psychiatric issues. So I would say, is that worth it? I would say, is that hand-eye improvement worth the potential detrimental effects that you might be having with screen time? With social media, it's interesting. Many of our young people, they find their tribe, they find community online. And I get that, especially marginalized communities, you might find community, right? And that was the great promise. The great promise, you can remember the before times, before social media. The promise of social media was it was going to be the great connector, and it was going to give community to people. But if that were true, why are Gen Zs and millennials, quote unquote, the loneliest generation, where 1 out of 4 millennials have 0 friends? Why has social media led to such an antisocial state of affairs? And so it's what I think we're experiencing is that digital connectivity doesn't really equal meaningful social relationships that we need to really be healthy human beings. So we need face-to-face contact and human interaction. And so social media and other digital experiences act as an illusory form of connection. Yes, is it better than, during COVID, if I couldn't see grandma, if I could have a Zoom session with grandma? Definitely better to Zoom grandma than to not Zoom grandma. But for issues, outliers like that aside, for the most part, they seduce people into thinking that they're socially connected. I have friends on my gaming platform. I have friends online. I'm in a relationship with someone that I've never met in 3 years, but I have a relationship. It gives us a false sense of connectivity. And that's why you find that these, not only depression rates are up there, and the other layers of the onion with depression are, we know that, like when I have an adult client who's mild to moderately depressed, we usually recommend physical activity and some kind of group activity, join a knitting club, a book reading club, go to the library, do a Tai Chi class, do something with other people, because we know that community is antidepressive. And we know that physical activity raises serotonin levels and really is healthy for you. When you think about what screen time has done, screen time has dropped a nuclear bomb on physical activity and interpersonal community. And so now we have a lot of young people who are now sedentary, screen staring, meaning devoid, don't have genuine community. And the communities that we are seeing on the negative side, we're seeing a lot of negative influencer communities. So not just Kardashians and let's call them the junk values of the materialism Kardashian world, but we're also seeing psychiatric influencers who are, I've written about this in Digital Madness. The subtitle is How Social Media is Driving Our Mental Health Crisis. We have young people struggling for community or connection who are latching on to influencers who are influencers in borderline personality disorder, dissociative identity disorder, the TikTok Tourette's phenomenon, who are aspirational performative influencers in their psychiatric and wellness, ostensibly to raise awareness about their disorder. But now you have vulnerable young people, oftentimes who are now in a social contagion-like way, are beginning to mimic or share some of those unwell symptoms. So you're seeing that as well. And I see that in the clinic that we run a residential treatment program in Austin, Texas. And a lot of our young people will come in with certain diagnoses. And, we do a digital detox for 6 weeks. So we take away the digital toxin. And oftentimes, not every time, but many times you'll see the psychiatric issue dissipate. Once they're away from the social media contagion, the symptoms go away of what they thought that they had, because they're no longer getting shaped or influenced by the influencers that were maybe less than healthy. Yeah. So that's another dynamic.
Yeah, it's interesting, Nicholas. I've actually seen exactly the same thing in clinic too with a lot of my teens that come in. They're watching so much that they no longer know what's theirs, what's not theirs, where they got it from exactly. Everything becomes mixed up.
Yeah, and there's also, I think there's a gestalt now where it's aspirational to have a laundry list of psychiatric disorders. It's kind of cool. I hate to say it, but it becomes kind of cool. So we have clients that come in, young females, young males who know the DSM better than the therapists, who have stuff, back in the day, 20, 30 years ago, you had hypochondriacs who knew the physician's desk reference and they would self-diagnose themselves. But we have many young people today who are coming into our clinic and they'll say, I have A, B, C, D, E disorder. And you're like, okay, hold on. Let's pump the brakes a little bit. Let's let the dust settle. Let's get to know you a little bit. Let's see what's actually going on. But it seems to be giving them a sense of identity for people that need identity and are losing a sense of intrinsic identity and value in this really confusing digital age that we're in.
Dr. Gordon Neufeld talks a lot actually about how we used to take our guidance vertically. So from a therapist, a doctor, grandparents, mom and dad. But now for so many of our youth, their guidance is horizontal. So it's peers, it's influences, but it's not necessarily somebody who's coming in with knowledge or value systems. So that's shifted the dynamics of everything.
Yeah, the old cliche, it takes a village. We had a sense of that the community was the healing agent. I wrote about in my new book, there was a horrific event that happened in Nova Scotia. There was the explosion in Nova Scotia Harbor, 1919. I think it was there, 9/11. I had not even heard about this incident until I did some research. But the point was that this community had an explosion. There was a ship that was loaded with munitions in the harbor that exploded, where over 2,000 people were horribly burned and died in that accident. And they did a meta-analysis looking at all the people that had survived that incident, the Canadian or the Nova Scotian 9/11. And people have an amazing sense of intrinsic resilience if they have the right community supports. There was no such thing as psychotherapy back then. I mean, there was psychoanalysis, but not available to most village people or most common folks. And the narrative was we were living in a much healthier, supported, community-like way that helped us get through the slings and arrows of life. Now we're living in this way that is really not healthy, that is isolating and atomizing. And that so if I do go through some issue of turbulence in my life, a breakup, a divorce, a job loss, death, illness, I'm less able to handle it. My psychological immune system is compromised. And part of it now is because our young people are growing up through this digital funnel that they're growing up in, they're not developing the resilience traits that we need to. In this instant gratification, narcissistic fueling environment, young people are, I hate to say it, I sound like an old timer, kids today, but young people today are lacking that core resilience that you get from falling down, failing, having to get yourself back up. Angela Duckworth, who wrote Grit, and really looked at some of the ingredients that go into developing this grit resilience model are absent in today's virtual world. And so you have kids who are not developing grit and resilience. They get into secondary school. There's a little bit of helicopter parenting and pampering. Then they land at university or they go into the workforce and they're entirely ill-equipped to handle life on life's terms. And now it begins to look like depression, anxiety, and acting out types of behavior because they've never developed, as I mentioned before, the psychological immune system to handle these situations for a complex variety of sociological reasons. including screen time immersion.
It's huge. When you look at it across the lifespan, we start off so innocently kind of playing whatever it may be, a kid's game, but it progresses until finally, like you said, we have these college age students who don't know how to handle their world when life inevitably hits those road bumps.
Well, think about even just the narcissistic aspect of our virtual world, right? We talk about because of predictive algorithms and because of the way that the digital world is created, it's curated to really meet what the algorithm thinks our needs are or our preferences are, right? And that might sound simple if you're just shopping for a pair of shoes. We all know that if we shop for a pair of shoes for the next 3 days, your news feed is going to have shoes and shoes and shoes. And so in a very real way, it's a very curated experience. So think if you're a 12-year-old or a 13-year-old and your virtual world is literally created in your image. As you seek something, as you think something, you see it echoed back to you. And so that can create a sense of, I am the center of my world, because in the very real sense, you are the center of your digital world because of these very curated, predatory predictive algorithms. I've begun to see algorithms and social media as acting almost as heat-seeking missiles that target psychological vulnerability, because we know that what drives engagement is emotional reactivity. And we know that typically good emotions don't have the same stickiness, as the IT folks call it, as negative emotions. So if I can get your fear, or if I can get your other emotional response levels up, those algorithms will do, and so they did this, for example, with the Wall Street Journal did an interesting thing where they created 13 fictitious profiles of young, fictitious adolescent females who had body image issues. And then within 24 hours, they had thousands and thousands of content, algorithms firing at them 24/7, hashtag skin and bones, 100 calories or less, anorexia imagery, really unhealthy imagery. And as unhealthy as it was, because we know anorexia is one of the most fatal disorders for young people, and even though the algorithm is supposed to be value neutral, it understood that a person with body image issues won't be able to look away from some of these images, even though it's going to increase their body image problems and they found at Meta that it was by 17%. And the internal emails at Meta was interesting, because when they were looking, Frances Haugen was the Facebook whistleblower that went to Congress, and she showed the emails and the playbook that they were using. They had internal discussions about whether they should turn down the dial on the algorithms to make them less predatory, less attacking of psychological vulnerability. And they said, absolutely not. That's going to decrease engagement. So if I'm a young person struggling with suicide thoughts, self-harm thoughts, I'm going to get content about suicide. And we know that that's not a good intersection, but that's the current landscape. Soulless, as I said, like heat-seeking missiles attacking our young people. That's where we're at right now with these predictive algorithms that are not just sending you shoe ads, they're sending you content that's going to inflame and exacerbate your unwellness.
It's just, as I hear that, it actually hurts my heart. It's like we've got these children who are developing and learning and trying to figure out who they are in the world. And then we also have so much working against them at the same time.
They're swimming in such, I really do feel sorry for children today, because they're swimming in such turbulent seas right now. There's so much information overload, exposure to so much toxic content that, even 30 years ago feels like some kind of Norman Rockwell bygone era of simplicity. When the news was just 30 minutes in the evening on the evening news, when you just had the evening paper, when you had the ability to ride your bicycle with your friends and just to be present. All those are vestiges of a bygone era, unfortunately.
Yeah. Nicholas, for parents listening in who are going, a lot of this, or at least some of this, sounds like my kid, where it feels like there may be digital dependency. Where do they even start to pull back a little bit and help their child, and maybe help themselves too?
Yeah, so I think some of the countervailing forces here, what you can do. So there's a tipping point where a child, it's the same thing with the substance use. Somebody can have a drinking problem, and then there's a tipping point where you go to full-blown alcoholism or alcohol addiction. But when you're still on the one side of the fence where it's still maybe a problem, what I would encourage parents to do is to backdoor real life activities, music, sports, social engagements, camp experiences. All those things act as protective factors for kids to fall fully into the rabbit hole. Kids tend to shut down parents who lecture them about screen time. And so if you don't talk to them about I mean, yes, you should have a conversation about screen time. I'm going to put that on the shelf for 1 second, but encourage them to have real life experiences without saying, you're on your phone too much. I want you to do this instead. Instead of just saying,
true.
hey, I signed you up for this phenomenal music camp. I'd like you to go. And not even mentioning that that's as a counter-strike to their screen time. Having said that, what I find very effective in my treatment program with young people is, for example, the documentary, The Social Dilemma. That was the first documentary that pulled back the curtain, and where you have now the screen moguls themselves saying, this is our playbook, this is how we're manipulating you, this is how we're essentially exploiting you and monetizing you. So no teenager or young adult wants to feel that they're being told what to do, especially by their parents. But when I tell my clients, my young clients, hey, you don't want your mom and dad telling you what to do, but you know who's really telling you what to do and who's shaping you to do what you do? Big tech. And here's how they're doing it. And then I would show them like The Social Dilemma, or show them I would get into the weeds of how the current digital landscape is actually monetizing them, using them. That's when you get a visceral response of, hell no, I don't want to be manipulated and used like that. Well, good. If you don't want to be used like that, begin to own your life back. Begin to now live in the real world. Begin to take your agency back, right? And so those are some buttons to push that I think can be really helpful with young people, because a lot of times they don't realize, they just think, look, everyone's online, everyone's doing social media. They don't realize what's behind the curtain and how really manipulative it is, and how really, really smart behavioral psychologists are you creating these platforms to be habit forming, to be mind shaping, to be behavior modifying. All those things are baked into this innocent, TikTok feed that you have. So,
and I love it. I feel like there's so many more, there's so much more awareness. There's newer documentaries coming out all of the time. There's books coming out now saying to kids, this is what's happening. So I feel like we're at the stage right now where we can give them information that's not just from me, mom, who's annoying and who has been annoying them forever. It's somebody else going, look at what's happening. And it's a more immersive experience too if they're watching something. So they can go, okay, what's happening? Let's talk about this. Let's actually engage critical thinking and look at what's going on here.
Exactly. Mom and dad as you know, I'm a parent, there's a certain point where we get tuned out. And if there's other members of the choir who might resonate, who echo that. There's a movement now, there's a grassroots movement that I'm really thrilled to see. There's a lot of young people now who are beginning to, it's cool to have a flip phone or to go use a Wise phone now. There's an organization that I'm involved, recently got asked to be involved in on their board called Humanality. And Humanality is here in the United States. They are young people that have formed college clubs, and now they're spreading it to high schools, where it's low tech. It's young people who are basically trying to own their lives back, who want to break free of the bondage of the smartphone. And so every member gets called a Wise phone. The Wise phone looks like a smartphone, so you're not going to get, ostracized for having a flip phone, but it's not Wi-Fi compatible, so there's no social media, there's no gaming, but you can text and you can call and you can listen to music. And then they do all sorts of experiential adventures together. They go hiking, they go on these adventures. And so Humanality was started by a group of young people who they got some big corporate sponsors to help get them involved, to donate these phones and everything else. But it was grassroots, and it was really great to see. So that's on a grassroots level. From a legislative, political, legal level, I'm involved in the class action lawsuits that are happening right now. Right now, there's multiple law firm, multiple state class action lawsuits with over 10,000 plaintiffs who are essentially suing big tech for harms done to their children, either suicide or other kind of harms that have been done intentionally by design. It's the same legal strategy that was used against big tobacco back in the 50s. You're knowingly selling our children a carcinogen. You knew it was a carcinogen and you lied about it. Same playbook that was used with Purdue Pharmaceuticals and OxyContin. So in these class action lawsuits, it's interesting because I'm involved with it, and I'm on these biweekly meetings with the legal teams because I'm a consultant on the case. The big tech companies are crying uncle. They want to settle, but what they're asking for now is more than just damages to the families that have been harmed. We're asking for regulatory changes, warning labels. We want to do exactly the same thing that happened with tobacco and OxyContin, an awareness and the change in predatory practices from these, really large multinationals that are really destroying so many people intentionally. They know they're harming kids. That's what gets to me. They go in front of Congress. You'll see Zuckerberg. You'll see, the big tech oligarchs will go in front of Congress every 6 months. They'll say, we're sorry. We'll look at it. Yes, we violated some antitrust laws. Yes, we've hurt some kids, but we'll get back to you on that. And nothing ever seems to happen. And what the only thing that seems to get changed is unfortunately litigation. And that's what's happening currently right now. And it'll be about an 18-month to 2-year process. But I think at the end of the day, we're going to see some changes.
Yeah, it gives me hope for the world that my little girls are growing up in. I think we've gone the one way. Hopefully we start to come back the other way again. Nicholas, for everybody listening in, where can they find out more about you?
So my website is www.drcordaris.com. That's pretty much, I don't have
Everything's
too much
there.
of a social media presence, but I can be reached there. I do the treatment program in Austin called Omega Recovery. You could also, if you are struggling and you have young loved ones who are struggling, you can reach out to Omega Recovery. That's omegarecovery.org. And we've been treating this issue for 8 years now, residentially in Austin, and working on other initiatives and projects to really just try to, I think, reclaim our humanity. I mean, it's the best way that I can put it, because now you have the AI cherry on the cake, which will really complicate things. The thing that gets to me, and I wrote about this in Digital Madness, is when you really look at some of the tech oligarchs, whether it's Sergey Brin or Larry Page at Google, or whether it's Bill Gates, I was really asking myself the question, is it just about money? Is this just greed? Are they just trying to swallow up the world with their platforms just to monetize us? And then you read Ray Kurzweil, who was a senior Google guru. And if you read Bill Gates considers Ray Kurzweil his mentor. Ray Kurzweil was a genius, Caltech. He was from Queens, New York originally. He wrote a book called The Singularity is Near, and he lays it out. He's a he's a transhumanist, and he believes that we're at this cusp of the next level of human evolution. And so in his reality, and he's about 80 years old, he believes that the AI innovation is going to lead to this marriage of human machine reality that is going to be, essentially it's an immortality play. And if you look at where Google has invested $25 billion into a company called Calico. And Calico is a biological life extension company, because their narrative is we're a few years away from the singularity. The singularity is this human machine AI immortality reality. They're trying to stay alive long enough to see this thing happen. It sounds a bit bizarre and crazy. All you have to do is read it in their own words. Ray Kurzweil, look up his book, The Singularity is Near. Look up what Bill Gates has said about Ray Kurzweil. And that seems to be driving a lot of their motives. It seems to be a lot of their motives behind attaining as many resources as possible by monetizing as many of us as possible, so they can, I think, achieve this very non-human goal. So there's that. I did want to throw that in there at the end, because I do think, motives are important. I think when we understand the people that we're struggling against, this speaks a little bit to who they are, I think what they're looking to do.
And I love that. I think just the holding on to that, what we need to do is reclaim humanity, reclaim those experiences that make us all human, being outside, playing, vulnerable conversations with friends, having to apologize face to face with somebody, all of those things that have dissipated somewhat. This is about coming back to that real, authentic human experience.
Yeah, so I think, touching the grass, being outdoors, I think, so nature immersion is a big part of it, because it grounds us back into our physicality and our humanity. The other part that I talk about in terms of, a metaphor that I like to use is learning how to be better swimmers in turbulent water, because the water is going to continue to be turbulent. We're not going to make the ocean calmer. But what are those better swimming skills? And so those are teaching our kids critical thinking, teaching them ethical discernment, teaching our kids resilience. But critical thinking is a big one, because social media is an emotions economy, and it thrives and it lives off of, like we said earlier, negative emotions. But if a young person can develop the ability to critically think, which is why I had written a book years ago called How Plato and Pythagoras Can Save Our Lives, there's a lot of wisdom in the ancient Western world about ancient Greek philosophy talked about living a certain kind of way. I mean, you ask the deep questions, the why questions. You would look up at the night sky and have a sense of awe and wonder. A lot of the young people that I work with today, they've lost that. There's no curiosity. They're just being stimulated so much. They're just addicted to stimulation and dopamine. And it saddens me, because part of the journey of growing up and being a young person is looking up, as I said, at the night sky, being curious about nature around you. And that so many of our young people are dulled to those experiences. So if we can expose our kids to nature, critical thinking, deeper types of intrinsic experiences, values that are more meaningful rather than who's got the most likes or followers, which is the coin of the realm for social media, which so turns upside down the value system of our young people. You know, the average American high school kid wants to be a YouTuber. It's the number one vocational choice today. And 20 years ago was astronaut. But in China, the number one vocational aspiration is still astronaut. So, you know, I do feel in a very real way that our kids are under attack. And it's our role to help immunize them from some of these attacks and to make them better swimmers in these turbulent times.
Beautiful. I think that's such a beautiful note for us to end on. Thank you so much, Nicholas.
Tanya, great. Thank you so much for having me on your podcast.